Look closely at the map, not the map of Donetsk, not the map of Zaporia. Look at the other map, the one that stretches from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Because while the whole world is watching the explosions in the West, the largest silent land grab in modern history is unfolding in the East. Intelligence reports confirm it. Economic data proves it. And the Kremlin either cannot stop it or simply refuses to see it. Vladimir Putin went to war in Ukraine to make Russia great again, to restore its empire, to project strength. But here is what he actually achieved. He hollowed out the very Russia he claimed to be defending. And into that hollow, two powers are quietly moving in: China and North Korea. Not with tanks, not with missiles, with contracts, pipelines, workers, and debt. This is the story of the silent invasion, the one that will redraw the world map, not in Donbass, but in Siberia. The one that will determine Russia's fate, not on the battlefield, but in a boardroom in Beijing. Welcome back to World Brief Daily. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and enable notifications, because what you are about to hear is the geopolitical story of the century, and we are just getting started. Let's begin with the back door. Everyone talks about Russia's front door, the tanks grinding through Donetsk, the drones buzzing over Moscow, the artillery duels near Pokrovsk. That is the war you see on your screen, but there is another war, quieter, slower, and in the long run, far more consequential. Defense UA and Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SCR, were among the first institutions to formally sound the alarm. In a detailed intelligence assessment, they warned that Moscow is effectively trading its own territory for war support. To get artillery shells from Kim Jong-un and economic lifelines from Xi Jinping, Putin is paying a price that no previous Russian leader ever paid. He is paying with sovereignty. He is paying with land. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service stated plainly, and I quote their assessment, Russia is increasingly paying its allies for support in the war against Ukraine with its own territory. That is not a Ukrainian propaganda line. That is a documented intelligence conclusion published and cited by multiple Western outlets. Now let's understand the scale of what we are talking about, because the numbers are staggering. The Russian Far East is not just remote wilderness. It is an area approaching 7 million square kilometers. 7 million. That is nearly half of the entire Russian Federation's landmass. It is rich in oil, gas, coal, timber, rare earth minerals, and fresh water. For decades, Russia guarded it jealously. It planted flags on Arctic seafloors. It deployed its most advanced air defense systems, its S-400s, to protect Vladivostok. It stationed elite armored divisions along the Chinese border. And where are those S-400s today? Burning in Crimea. And where are those tank divisions stuck in the mud near Pokrovsk? Russia is naked in the east. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. To understand what is happening, you have to think like a Chinese historian, not a Russian propagandist. In Russia, the Far East is called simply the Far East, a frontier, an asset, a treasure chest. But in China, that same territory has a different name, Outer Manchuria, and it carries a very different emotional weight. Beijing has never forgotten the unequal treaties of the 19th century, the Treaty of Aun in 1858, the Convention of Peking in 1860. Through these agreements, a weakened Qing dynasty was forced to cede more than 1 million square kilometers of resource-rich land to the Russian czars. For 160 years, that was a quiet grudge, a historical wound that Chinese nationalists nursed in silence. That silence is now ending. As reported by The Telegraph, China is reclaiming its backyard, not through military force, but through what experts are calling soft annexation. Millions of hectares of land are being leased to Chinese agricultural companies. Russian cities like Blagochensk are becoming economic satellites of Chinese metropolises just across the river. In these cities, signs appear in Chinese. Transactions are conducted in yuan, and the future increasingly is written in Beijing. Ukrainian intelligence estimates that up to 2 million Chinese citizens now live in the corridor between Vladivostok and the Ural Mountains, forming enclaves where Russians seldom work. And according to reporting from the Saratoga Foundation's analysis of 2025 investment data, cargo turnover through Russia's primary region with China increased by 36% in the first half of 2025 alone. Approximately 800 trucks cross the border daily. This is not trade. This is absorption. And if China is the economic predator moving in from the south and east, North Korea is something else entirely. North Korea is embedding itself with something far more permanent than commerce. It is embedding itself with bodies. The BBC reported that by 2024, more than 10,000 North Korean workers had already been sent to Russia in what it described as slave-like conditions, in direct violation of UN sanctions banning North Korean overseas labor. Their wages do not go to them. Their salaries flow directly back to Kim Jong-un's regime, funding, according to multiple intelligence assessments, his nuclear and ballistic missile programs. But the workers are only part of the story. By late 2024, the world was confronted with something unprecedented. North Korean combat troops in Russian uniforms with fake Russian identities were fighting and dying in the Kursk region of Russia. The South Korean National Intelligence Service, the NIS, confirmed this in detail. The UK Ministry of Defense published an intelligence update stating that North Korean forces suffered more than 6,000 casualties during the fighting in Kursk, 6,000 casualties from a single deployment. According to a Reuters investigation published in spring 2025, North Korea was providing more than half of all artillery shells being used by the Russian military in Ukraine. More than half. Think about that. The Russian army, the so-called second army in the world, could not sustain its own war without buying shells from one of the poorest and most isolated countries on earth. By June 2025, Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu traveled to Pyongyang and announced publicly that another 1,000 North Korean military workers would be deployed to Kursk for demining and an additional 5,000 for reconstruction work. And in September of that same year, President Putin stood before cameras and publicly thanked Kim Jong-un for the North Korean troops fighting against Ukraine. Out loud, Russia's most decorated soldiers are dying in Ukraine, and the Kremlin's answer is to call Pyongyang. But before we go any further, we want to take a moment to thank you, yes, you, for being part of the World Brief Daily community. If this analysis is giving you clarity on what the mainstream media is missing, please share this video with someone who needs to understand it, and make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss our deep dives. Hit that bell icon right now. We'll be right back to the story. Now, back to Russia's economic catastrophe. There is a question hanging over all of this. Why would Putin allow it? Why would the man who built his entire identity around Russian greatness, Russian strength, Russian sovereignty, why would he allow China and North Korea to absorb his country's east? The answer is simple, and it is devastating. He is broke. The Bell, the highly respected independent Russian financial outlet, confirmed that Russia has begun selling its gold reserves to plug the massive holes left in the national budget. When a country sells its gold, it is not executing a strategy. It is bleeding out. And when Russia sells, who has the cash to buy? China. Always China. Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, published an analysis in Foreign Affairs that put it plainly. Russia is now becoming a vassal of China. He wrote, "In a few years, Beijing will be able to dictate the terms of economic, technological, and regional cooperation with Moscow." This is not fringe analysis. This is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The numbers tell the full story. Before 2022, China accounted for roughly 1/5 of Russia's foreign trade. Significant, but manageable. Today, after 3 years of war and Western sanctions, that dependency has become structural, total, and irreversible. According to estimates by the Kiev School of Economics, as early as 2023, 76% of all high-tech components used in the Russian arms industry came from China. Not a quarter, not half, 76%. Russia cannot fight its own war with its own weapons anymore. And then there is the automotive sector, which tells you everything you need to know about what is happening to the Russian economy at street level. Walk into a Russian car dealership today, and you will find something that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. In 2019, Chinese car brands represented just 2% of the Russian market. By 2024, according to analysis from the Center for Eastern Studies, that figure had climbed to nearly 60%. And in the heavy truck segment, the backbone of any industrial economy, Chinese brands now account for 65%. Russia's three largest automotive companies, Kamaz, Gaz, and Avtovaz, responded in 2024 by shortening their work weeks. They cannot compete. The legendary Russian and Western car industry has simply ceased to exist. It has been replaced by Chinese imports. But here is the crucial detail. Russia is not even manufacturing these Chinese cars. It is assembling kits shipped from Chinese factories. The value is added in China. The engineering happens in China. The profit returns to China. Russia's role in this arrangement, assembly worker. Russia, a country that once built MiG fighters and T-72 tanks and Soyuz rockets, is now screwing together Chinese car kits in the shell of what used to be Soviet industry. This is not import substitution. This is industrial suicide. And now we come to the energy trap. This is where the relationship between Russia and China stops looking like a partnership and starts looking like a hostage situation. For years, Putin had a plan to replace his lost European gas market with a massive new pipeline to China, the power of Siberia too. He needed the deal desperately. It would have given him leverage, revenue, and a way out of his economic isolation. But the Financial Times reported that Xi Jinping has been stalling, ghosting Putin in effect. Why? Because Beijing knows that Russia has nowhere else to go. China is demanding a gas price that is essentially equivalent to Russia's own domestic subsidized rate. In practical terms, this means Beijing wants Russia's most strategically valuable resource at near zero profit. This is not a negotiation between equals. This is a power telling a supplicant what it will pay, and the supplicant nodding because what choice does it have? Putin, the man who tried to freeze Europe, who used gas as a weapon of geopolitical coercion for 20 years, is now being squeezed by his own best friend until there is nothing left. And how does Russia get paid for what it does sell? Reuters has documented a profound crisis in the Russian banking system. Even though China and Russia are officially allies, major Chinese financial institutions have been blocking Russian payments because they are terrified of Western secondary sanctions. Russian companies are now reporting payment delays of up to 6 months. 6 months to receive payment for goods already delivered. Russia sold its sovereignty to escape the dollar, and it ended up trapped in a currency, the yuan, that it cannot even freely use. The Kremlin traded the tyranny of the dollar for the dungeon of the yuan, and the dungeon keeper in Beijing is not sharing the keys. Now let's talk about what is happening in the Arctic, because this is the part that should frighten everyone watching. For decades, the Arctic was Russia's holy grail. Moscow guarded its northern coastline with an obsession that bordered on religious. They planted a Russian flag on the seafloor beneath the North Pole in 2007. They invested billions in Arctic military bases. They built icebreakers. They claimed the Northern Sea route as essentially their sovereign commercial highway. This was not just a resource play, it was an identity. Now the Barron Observer has reported that a desperate sanction-strangled Russia has begun opening its Arctic ports and infrastructure projects to Chinese companies. Beijing, a country with no Arctic coastline, has spent years calling itself a near-Arctic state. It published an Arctic policy paper. It built its own icebreakers. And now, with Russia too weak and too poor to develop the region alone, China is walking in through the door that Putin has left open. China calls this the Polar Silk Road. And Beijing is building the infrastructure, running the logistics, and securing the resource extraction rights for what may be the most strategically important region of the 21st century. By letting China into the Arctic, Russia is handing away not just present resources, it is handing away the future. And then there is the question of Russia's digital sovereignty, or rather, what is left of it. When Western companies Ericsson and Nokia were forced to exit Russia after 2022, someone had to fill the void in telecommunications infrastructure. That someone was Huawei. According to analysis by the Carnegie Endowment, Russia has now built its emerging 5G network and critical internet infrastructure on Chinese technology. Every phone call, every bank transaction, every military order transmitted over that network now passes through architecture designed and supplied by a Chinese state-linked company. This is not just economic dependency, this is the digital leash. If Xi Jinping were to decide tomorrow to restrict access, to turn off the information flow, to insert himself into Russia's communications backbone, he has that capability. Putin has handed the keys to his country's nervous system to a foreign power. Let us now address perhaps the deepest, most personal humiliation of all, the collapse of Russian technological prestige. For decades, the dynamic was clear. Russia was the teacher. China was the student. Moscow sold Beijing jet engines, aircraft design, submarine technology, air defense systems. Russia taught China. Russia was the senior partner. That era is over. While Russia is begging North Korea for low-tech artillery shells, China has surpassed Russia in drone technology, stealth fighter development, and naval shipbuilding. Russia, once the world's second arms exporter, is now a buyer of Korean ammunition. And according to multiple intelligence reports, China is no longer particularly interested in buying Russian weapon systems. It already knows how to make them. What China is now interested in, what Beijing's defense companies are actively pursuing, is Russian scientists. With the ruble collapsing and salaries crumbling in real terms, Chinese defense firms have been systematically recruiting Russia's best engineers and physicists to work in Chengdu and Shenyang. Russia is being stripped of its intellectual property. The junior partner is now dismantling the senior partner for parts. But who is noticing all of this within Russia? The Moscow Times has reported that even Russian nationalist bloggers and military commentators, the very people who spent years screaming about NATO expansion, who celebrated every meter of Ukrainian territory captured, are now looking east with alarm. They see their cities turning Chinese. They realize the profound irony. Putin sent their sons to die in Ukraine, supposedly to protect Russian speakers in Donbass, supposedly to push NATO back from Russia's borders, supposedly to reassert Russian greatness. And while those sons were bleeding in the mud near Avdivka and Potursk, the actual Russian land, Siberia, the Far East, the Arctic, was being quietly absorbed by a foreign power without a single shot being fired. The patriot in the Kremlin has become the man giving away the motherland. And the East Asia Forum has provided a brilliant framework for understanding why China is doing this with such patience and precision. Beijing is not trying to help Russia win. Beijing is helping Russia not lose too quickly. Because a weak, desperate, isolated Russia is the perfect neighbor for China. A Russia that is desperate sells cheap oil. A Russia that is bankrupt votes with China at the United Nations. A Russia that is fighting NATO distracts the United States from Taiwan. Xi Jinping is playing the long game. He does not need to invade Siberia with tanks. He just needs to wait. To wait until Russia is so exhausted, so indebted, so dependent, that it falls into Beijing's lap like a ripe apple falling from a dying tree. And the regional fallout from this shift is massive. Japan and South Korea are watching the slow implosion of Russia with deep unease. Not because they had any love for Putin's Russia, but because a collapsing nuclear-armed state leaking power to China and embedding North Korean military assets on its own soil. That is a destabilizing force unlike anything the Pacific Rim has seen since the end of the Cold War. Russia's weakness is speeding up Japan's remilitarization. It is pushing South Korea closer to nuclear options of its own. Putin's failure is reshaping the security architecture of the entire Pacific. There is one more resource we have not discussed yet, one that may ultimately matter more than oil or gas or rare earth minerals: water. Lake Ball holds 20% of the world's entire supply of unfrozen fresh water. It is the deepest lake on Earth. For Russians, it is sacred. For northern China, which is facing a water crisis driven by aquifer depletion and climate-driven drought, it is a lifeline. The Moscow Times has reported on local protests in the Baal region against Chinese bottling operations and companies seeking water extraction rights. While Russian soldiers fight for the Donbass, Chinese companies are methodically securing rights to Russia's most precious long-term resource. Analysts predict that water leases will be the next concession Putin makes, not because he wants to, because he has no choice. So let us step back. Let us look at the complete picture. In the West, Russia is burning its army, its budget, and its entire generation of young men in a war of attrition that it cannot win cleanly and cannot afford to lose entirely. The war is consuming $100 billion annually. By some estimates, it has killed or maimed hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. It has destroyed the consumer economy, triggered capital flight, and sparked an inflation crisis that the Kremlin is struggling to suppress. In the East, Russia is selling its land to Chinese agricultural companies, selling its gas at subsidized prices, selling its Arctic access, selling its scientists, selling its communications infrastructure, selling its gold, and embedding tens of thousands of foreign workers and soldiers. Soldiers who, as history teaches us, have a way of not leaving onto Russian sovereign territory. This is the paradox of Vladimir Putin's legacy. He launched the largest land war in Europe since 1945 to prevent what he called NATO encirclement of Russia. And in doing so, he created something NATO never could have created: a China encirclement of Russia. From the south, from the east, from the Arctic above, from the digital infrastructure below. Carnegie Russia, Eurasia Center Director Alexander Gabuev wrote it clearly. The deepening vassalage to China is Putin's own choice. This is the price Putin is making the country pay for chasing his dream of dominating Ukraine. A former senior Russian market regulation official speaking to the Moscow Times on condition of anonymity was even blunter. The Russian market will never be the same again. Europeans and Americans will no longer be able to regain any Russian segment of goods. In place of many Western countries, one giant supplier has stepped in: China. Consequently, everything in key sectors of the economy now hangs on the goodwill of Beijing. Everything hangs on Beijing's goodwill. The man who promised Russians the restoration of empire has delivered them a new form of subjugation. Not Western liberal democracy, which he raged against, but Chinese economic dominance, which he invited in through the back door. Future historians will be struck by the dark irony of it. In 1949, China was the USSR's vassal state, a revolutionary government that tried to emulate everything Soviet that depended on Moscow for industrial blueprints, military technology, and political legitimacy. That vassalage lasted a decade before Mao broke free. 75 years later, the roles have completely reversed, and this time, the inversion may be permanent. Russia has lost its European markets and cannot rebuild them. That much is now clear. American businesses are not returning to Putin's Russia. And in Europe, there is no political appetite to restore the pre-war gas dependency, regardless of what happens on the battlefield. Russia is locked into China. The dependency is structural. It is generational. It is, as Carnegie analysts conclude, essentially irreversible as long as the current political system remains in Moscow. The silent invasion is not coming with guns. It is coming with contracts, pipelines, leases, workers, and debt. And when the dust finally settles in Ukraine, regardless of who controls which villages in Donetsk, the war for Russia's future will already have been decided. The winner will not be in Moscow. The winner will be in Beijing. And the loser will be the Russian people who were told they were fighting for greatness and who got colonial dependency instead. What do you think? Can Russia ever reverse this dependency? Is there a path for Moscow to escape China's gravitational pull? Or is this, as Carnegie and the East Asia Forum and Ukraine's own intelligence service all suggest, the permanent new reality of the Russian state? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read them, we learn from them, and they shape the stories we tell. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening in the shadows of this war, please hit the like button. It helps this kind of deep geopolitical work reach more people. Subscribe to World Brief Daily if you haven't already. Enable notifications because the next chapter of this story is already being written and you will not want to miss it. We will keep watching, we will keep reporting, and we will bring you the truth from behind the headlines. Thanks for watching.